agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. Today's show is going to be a little bit different than our normal weekend show, and that's because, as I mentioned in last week's episode, that we're going to give our hosts the week off on this. We normally record on Saturday mornings. August 15th is today. And we will be returning to our regular show next week. But there were some things that happened this week. And before we get to the main part of today's show, which will be first my interview with political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson, and then Jay will join me for some commentary that we recorded. But there were some things that happened this week, and I felt like I should at least maybe take a few minutes to talk about them, comment on them before we get to that. So this will actually be an extra long episode of the Politics Guys, I think, all things considered, though slightly different in format. And again, we'll be going back to our regular weekend show next week with Trey and Ken hosting the show. Maybe it was just the fact that I couldn't bear the thought of going 2 whole weeks without actually talking to you guys about what's going on in politics. That sounds actually about right. So anyway, there were three main stories this last week that I wanted to at least briefly comment on. The first one was, of course, Joe Biden's choosing Kamala Harris as his vice presidential pick. Now, the political science literature is pretty consistent in telling us that vice presidential choices just don't make much of a difference. There used to be the sort of thinking that, well, you could pick somebody for sort of geographical balance and maybe pull in a region and that sort of thing. Clearly, that wasn't Joe Biden's consideration, right? Because California is about as solidly Democratic as a state as you're likely to get. But so, I think that there are a number of ways to look at this pick. Certainly, in terms of picking a Black woman at this point in time, that is a strong symbolic choice, right? That's not to say that Joe Biden and the Democrats don't largely have at least the Black segment of the electorate largely sewn up. It tends to be blacks in voting tend to go, 90-something% for Democrats very strongly and solidly. But symbolic politics aside, and that's not an unimportant thing, increasing enthusiasm from your base. I think that Senator Harris is just generally a pretty solid and safe selection. And I think that's a more or less a consensus view. Now, I know there are some progressives, particularly, who are upset at the choice, given Harris's background as a prosecutor. But if you take a look at her voting record, now she hasn't been in the Senate that long. She came into the Senate in January 2017. But since that point, according to the rankings on voteview.com, which has comprehensive ideological rankings going back quite a ways, it's pretty interesting to check out, Harris is actually the second most liberal senator since coming into the Senate. And who's first? You might think it's Bernie. You'd be wrong. It's actually Elizabeth Warren, then Cory Booker, and then Bernie Sanders, again, this period from 2017. Now, that's pretty strongly liberal, right? And if you make a comparison, well, Barack Obama, when in the 2005 to 2007 period he was in the Senate, was actually only the 19th most liberal senator. So I think Republicans are right, and many whom are saying that this is the most progressive, or they'd call it the most far left, I guess, tomato, Democratic ticket, at least in terms of policy positions ever. I think that's a reasonable point. And of course, I see this as largely a good thing. Of course, part of that, though, I think is to rally the base. I don't think that in practice, this ticket, or if this ticket becomes an administration, which I think odds are it will, that it's going to be quite that liberal as the policy position suggests. I think that Joe Biden is by nature more of a moderate, or really maybe more of just kind of a political animal, if you will, than an ideologue. I've never felt, and Joe Biden's been in politics for longer than I've been around, certainly, at least as politically aware, he's not very hugely ideological. And I really think that the same is at least somewhat true of Harris, though, again, we're working with a lot smaller set of observations here. But I attribute her liberal voting record in her short time in the Senate according to a number of things. Number one, I think it's in part a function of her state. California is a very liberal state, obviously. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think it's also part of her strategy, which what I believe to have been her strategy for the last few years, to try to get the Democratic presidential nomination, approaching it from left of centrist, like people like Hillary Clinton, for instance. And also, I think partly a way of sort of minimizing or answering concerns from ideological progressives about her prosecutorial background. And then I also think, of course, that there are some general, policy views that she sincerely holds, but I think it's a lot of those things. I certainly don't see her as an ideologue in the same way that I would see, say, a Bernie Sanders or kind of a pragmatic policy wonk / ideologue like an Elizabeth Warren sort of thing. And so what I think is going to happen is if Harris and Biden are actually the administration, I guess it should be the other way around, right? Biden and Harris, I think facing a more, a less ideological winning coalition in the Senate, especially trying to need to get legislation through, even if the Senate does away with the filibuster, which I'm guessing they're going to do, they're going to have to tack to the center. And I think both of them are going to be okay doing that sort of. A couple other points I wanted to make is there was this ridiculous, I felt it was ridiculous thing in the media about Harris being too ambitious and not apologizing to Biden for going after him. And the first thought I had with that is, well, I don't really see that as having come up if Harris had been male. Maybe that's just me. Some people say, oh, geez, you're just overcompensating for being a white male and being overly sensitive. I know, I don't think so. I mean, I think terms like aggressive, when you hear that in a negative way, oftentimes is applied to women more than men, certainly. And so I think there is sort of a double standard on that. And I hope, certainly, as we have more women in high political office, and certainly having a female vice president would be great, maybe we'll see less of that, I would like to hope. Then, of course, there's this 2024 issue, which talk about she's thinking way far ahead. I mean, some people have pointed out maybe she's being set up as the future of the Democratic Party. And I don't really know that anyone can actually set the person up, but vice presidents don't have a bad track record, certainly better than almost anyone else at becoming presidents if you take a look at history. And I think, Joe Biden would be 78 if he's inaugurated in January of 2021, which would mean he'd be 82. Okay, do that math, Mike, for a second term. And that would be kind of old to run, though I don't know if it would. Well, we'll see what happens anyway. Again, putting the cart before the horse. But overall, I got to say, Kamala Harris, a totally reasonable, safe choice from somebody who I think is looking at the polls and looking at the situation and thinking, I don't need to take a big swing here. I just want to make sure I don't do anything crazy and damaging and so forth. And, I think good job, Joe Biden, on that. All right. The second thing I wanted to mention, it's a big story, I think, has to do with the Postal Service and the 2020 election. Is Donald Trump trying to kneecap the Postal Service to suppress votes to win the election? That certainly has been the narrative, right? Especially in a lot of the left of center media. For some reason, my go-to news choice, if I just want to quickly check some stuff, is CNN. And I don't know why, because they're further left than I am, and I have a problem with their I don't know. I'm going to say crazy is too strong, but they're further left. But I don't know. It's weird. I like the layout of their site, and that's an embarrassing reason to choose a site. But anyway, on CNN and other sites like that, there's been a lot about this sort of thing. And when I listened to or read Donald Trump's comments, I really feel like a lot of people are spinning them or twisting them. It seems to me that what Donald Trump was saying is that, hey, Democrats want this postal money for the Postal Service. And if they don't agree with me on this other stuff, they won't get it. So I think he was using it. My take was that it was just leverage, essentially. You want an agreement? You want this? I want that. Let's make a deal, essentially. Now, I think Donald Trump's prowess as the great deal maker has been wildly overestimated, as his record would suggest, at least in politics. But that seems to me that's mainly what's going on here. Donald Trump wants a policy win, wants to be able to say he did this stuff and got certain things. And the Democrats want more funding for the Postal Service. And honestly, if I were in the Democratic leadership, and this is maybe why I'm not in the Democratic congressional leadership, I'd say, tell you what, let's just do a simple deal. Let's do a series of smaller deals. And why don't we have one of them be a full funding for the Postal Service? And let's say, what would that be? I don't know. I'd say $15 billion wouldn't be overly insane, basically based on some figures I've seen, in exchange for a 6-month payroll tax freeze to employees. And that to me would be a deal that would have a lot of certainly support from the White House, and that would mean it would have support from Senator McConnell, who basically, as I talked about last week, seems to have outsourced legislation to the White House. But I could see that working, and then put President Trump in a position to say, well, how can I refuse that sort of thing if it's that simple, straightforward, no ups and no extras, and then we could work on some other things, kind of on a piecemeal basis. That's how I would approach it if policy were the thing that mattered most to me, and it does. And so that's how I kind of approach it. But that all said, I am glad that Democrats are sort of pushing back a little bit on this Postal Service issue. Again, I don't really think there's anything suspicious going on. The reporting that I've read seems to be a lot of cherry picking, finding some postal employees union saying, we don't know why these things are being moved, but I don't get a sense that there's some great plot. It's true that the Postmaster General, who's typically a career Postal Service employee, isn't now. DeJoy came in from the outside. He's a big Republican and Trump donor, and that that should set up a red flag. But also, he has a strong background in logistics, and you can certainly make the argument that given the dire straits the Postal Service is in, that maybe bringing in someone from the outside that have some new perspectives isn't a bad idea. Now, honestly, I think that the best idea would be to let the Postal Service set their own rates and working, and whether they want to deliver on Saturday or not, and just basically free the Postal Service. But that's not going to happen. That's a separate issue, and I've talked about that before. I'll get off that soapbox. But anyway, so my I guess where I come down on this is, there may be some issues, but I don't see them as being major issues, and I don't see this as being some part of a Republican Postal Service Postmaster General plot or strategy to disenfranchise voters. Third, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the agreement between the UAE and Israel. And, again, here's where my centrism, I guess, will show through, because a lot of folks on the left are saying this is just a big nothing burger, right? So what? And I get that. The whole Middle East peace thing is difficult, and we haven't seen much progress really in generations, certainly in my lifetime. But while this isn't peace in the Middle East or the big grand peace deal that President Trump, wanted, that heck every president has wanted, it's not nothing either. It's nice. I don't know, is not the word, but it's at least a step in the right direction that Israel is willing to, at least temporarily, halt annexation of Palestinian territory. And Israel's been very clear that this is a temporary thing in exchange for, opening up these relations, recognition between the UAE. So, that's how we move forward, I think, on these things, is we take, a little step forward, a little bit back. And will this hold? I am so pessimistic and cynical about Middle East peace, but I recognize this as not nothing. It's not the biggest thing in the world, certainly. We would all like, I think, something better, but it's not nothing. And so, hey, good for President Trump and the administration, to the extent that they were able to broker at least some sort of a minor deal. And maybe it turns out to be nothing, but I certainly hope not. And again, this is me. Maybe I'm trying to be a little more centrist on this in these comments because Jay isn't here to push back. But I want to try to, also say it's just because President Trump or the Trump administration does it or says it, that doesn't automatically mean it's evil. I think we need to look at these things, on a case by case basis. And here I think, this is, okay, not great, but okay. All right. And with that, I will end my comments and we will get on first with my interview with Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson, and then that will be followed by Jay's and my commentary. Also, a couple quick little things. Sorry, that was another. Also, I want to just remind you that we will have a midweek show, my interview with Ohio Supreme Court Justice Michael Donnelly, where we talk about things that really apply to national politics in a lot of ways, like the Michael Flynn case and the Paul Manafort case and sentencing issues and plea bargaining. Really interesting interview. That will be free for everyone on Wednesday. And finally, I should also say, I can't believe this, I forgot to thank our new Patreon supporter this last week, Taylor, and also our one-time PayPal supporters. You can do that, actually. I've said if Patreon is too much of a commitment, we've got that PayPal link up on politicsguys.com. You can make a pledge of support just once. And David and Robert have done that in the last week. Thank you guys so much for doing that. We really appreciate that. And of course, as a supporter, you get that second full-length episode every week. Normally, it's not free for everyone. You also get ad-free versions of all our shows when we are running ads, which is every once in a while, and various other things at different levels of support. To check it all out, politicsguys.com/support. And also to just get in touch with us, to say hi, whatever, comments, questions, critiques, mail at politicsguys.com. And finally, I promise this is the real finally, if you would like all of this content and you can't afford it, that's no problem. Just let me know. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make sure you get access to everything. We never want to let the lack of ability to pay to be a barrier to you getting all of our content. And I am happy to do that. And also, I should say, I want to really thank all the supporters who stepped up and actually increased their support because they felt like, hey, if you're giving this to free for some folks, and I want to kind of help to sort of subsidize that. And I hadn't even thought about that, but that's very cool of you. Thank you very much. And now I truly am finally going to shut up and we'll get to my interview with Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson. My guests today are Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson, political scientists at Yale and UC Berkeley, respectively. They're the authors of a number of very insightful books, including The Great Risk Shift, Winner-Take-All Politics, American Amnesia, and most recently, Let Them Eat Tweets, which we'll be discussing today. And I've had the pleasure a number of times in the past of talking with Professor Hacker, and so I'm very pleased to have both of the authors of all of these great books on, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
So I like to start oftentimes with titles and subtitles because I think they're chosen for a reason, not just marketing, and they can be sort of telling. And I mentioned the title of your book, Let Them Eat Tweets, but the subtitle is How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. And I know from reading many of your books in the past, economic inequality is a major concern for both of you and has been for a long time. So if you could just briefly get into why you feel that economic inequality is so dangerous.
Well, I'll kick things off by just saying that, it's not just a concern of us as scholars, but as citizens, because the degree of inequality and the rise of inequality in the United States is really without precedent in other rich democracies today, and with very little precedent in our own history. I mean, we are now back up to the levels of inequality that we saw in the Gilded Age, a century or so ago. But in fact, the inequality that we see today is occurring in a fully democratic society in which we expect a much greater role for government to address inequality than we did then. And so our work is really trying to understand, well, what happens when you have an ostensibly democratic system and you see this kind of massive imbalance of wealth and, we argue, political power. And we think this this imbalance has really run through the Republican Party and helps explain why the Republican Party has become this strange hybrid of right-wing populism and conservative plutocracy, by which we mean fealty to the richest of Americans in corporate America that we see today.
And so that would obviously reference the first part of the title, Let Them Eat Tweets, the sort of populist angle, which we're going to get to in a minute. And I should point out, because I know there always are objections or questions from listeners on the right when we talk about inequality, and we won't get into it in detail in this interview, but I would say that I think you both have made a very convincing case over the years that this isn't about envy. This is about most people struggling to get by and a very top sector moving ahead a great deal due to political decisions and not just the world being the way it is. And then there's that tie-in, right, with that economic power in our system translates very well into political power. So it becomes a sort of self-perpetuating thing, correct?
Well, yes. And I mean, in this book, in some of our earlier work, we've tried to explain the growth of inequality in the U.S. and why that growth is so much more dramatic in the United States than it has been in other rich democracies. But here, our main focus is on the political consequences of rising inequality. And we suggest that for democracy, it's really kind of a triple threat when you get such a dramatic shift in economic resources towards those at the top. And the three threats very quickly are, one is you really increase the political power of those privileged groups, because you can translate money into political power in various ways. And the second threat is that the more inequality you have, probably the bigger the gap is going to be in the interests of those at the top from those in the middle class or in the bottom, right? The wider that divergence is in their economic circumstances, the wider the gap is in their interests. And that is combined with their growing political powers is potentially a big problem for most Americans. And then the final threat is because of that, because there's this growing gap in interest and in power, democracy itself can start to be seen as problematic by the wealthy and economic elites. And so their support for democracy can decline in a context where they actually have good reason to fear that that anything that allows majorities to exercise their political will is potentially dangerous.
And I should point out that this isn't just theoretical. There's been an awful lot of research done in public policy outcomes that pretty convincingly demonstrates that when we see this divergence of interests, that the people at the top who have the economic power tend to get their way a strikingly disproportionate amount of the time.
Yeah, and we also draw on some really powerful historical political science work by the political scientist Daniel Ziblatt, who shows that a lot of this tension that's created by the growing distance between the rich and the rest runs through conservative parties. Historically, it's conservative parties that have been most closely allied with those at the top, and they're the parties that are also most challenged when the electorate expands to include working people. And Ziblatt calls this the conservative dilemma, and we pick up on that in the book and talk about how the Republican Party has faced its own version of the conservative dilemma as inequality has grown in the United States. It's not that the franchise is expanding, but it is that Republicans have faced a choice about whether and they want to ally with and how closely they want to ally with the new winners in the winner-take-all economy. And once having made that choice, as we show, they really did decide with plutocracy and really emphasize a policy program that was tilted toward the very top, including big tax cuts for the rich, as we saw in 2017. But once they made that decision, they had to figure out how to develop a set of electoral appeals that would appeal to voters who weren't winning out, indeed, who were losing ground in this economy. So getting back to the title, Trump's tweets are really, a metaphor for the Republican Party's substitution of these kinds of increasingly extreme appeals for a real response to the felt needs of ordinary voters who were losing out on rising inequality.
So it's a response to the dilemma of, well, you go where the money is, and that's sort of a necessity in our electoral system at this point. But where the money is, and that, like, it's not even 1%, it's a fraction of 1%, but that's not obviously where the votes are, and so you have to find a way to sort of thread that needle or get both of those things, and hence the dilemma. Now, there's a lot of really fascinating historical material in the book that I wasn't aware of, certainly some of the international stuff. But, it occurs to me, and it probably will occur to listeners, that, well, this sounds a lot like the situation that maybe we faced in the Gilded Age in early 20th century. And a lot of people would say, hey, that turned out okay. We got, a progressive movement, and we got all this other sort of stuff. And so, that's it seems like the Republican Party maybe handled it well this time. So maybe we're okay right now if we look back at history. But I'm guessing you're not. That would not be the position I know that you would take on this, correct?
Well, no, it would. I mean, we do think there's an optimistic scenario in which the U.S. moves out of the really challenging and we think potentially politically dangerous circumstances that they face at the moment. But there are less optimistic scenarios as well. I'm sure we'll get to that over the course of the conversation. It is important, we think, to look back at historical episodes. The Gilded Age is obviously an important one to look at, and as you say, the U.S. in a kind of haltingly way eventually was able to work through that. And so maybe we will be able to do that again. But just because it happened once doesn't mean that it will happen again. Obviously, circumstances are different in many ways than they were a century ago. And, one thing, we don't go into a huge amount of detail about this in the book because it's not meant to be sort of, extended historical analysis. But the party system then, in part because of the particular way that race fed into American politics, the party system looked actually quite different, and the nature of the Republican Party looked pretty different back in the late 19th and early 20th century than the way that it looks now. And so there were opportunities both within and outside that party for social reformers who really did want to do something about inequality to gain a foothold and produce a more progressive politics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that there are a lot of differences. And so maybe we can look back and say, well, it gives us grounds for some optimism, but certainly not for complacency, I guess, is kind of how I look at it. But coming more toward the present, your argument is that we really, really start to see on the right this alignment with the plutocrats kind of in the 1990s happening first in Congress and then in the presidency. I was hoping you could sort of briefly summarize what happened there and maybe even more importantly, why it happened.
Well, the what is pretty simple. Newt Gingrich, with his insurgency of conservative Republicans in Congress, took over the party. The how and why are both more complicated. So the first thing is really important to understand what Newt Gingrich was fighting against. He liked to say that he was only fighting two groups, Democrats and Republicans. And the Republicans he was fighting were the old guard Republicans, like the one who was in the White House in the late 1980s, George H.W. Bush, who agreed to raise taxes in 1990, and this, and particularly taxes on the rich. And Gingrich rebelled against that. He was also, of course, fighting Democrats, and to fight Democrats, he developed a new, much more confrontational style of politics that we know a lot about today. But one thing that I think we know less about is that Gingrich wasn't just a bomb thrower. He was also a huge rainmaker for the Republican Party. He built a machine that was then perfected by his successors, canny political operatives like Tom DeLay and John Boehner, who would, of course, go on to be Speaker of the House. And this machine was based on the idea that the new rich, the people who are winning out in this increasingly unequal economy, and corporate America, which was also becoming more consolidated and more wealthy. That these elements really had to sign up with the Republican Party, or they would pay the consequences. And so they built up the so-called K Street Project. They did this big thing called Project Relief, where they tried to reduce regulations on businesses, and in return for campaign donations, they basically ushered lobbyists into the inner sanctum of lawmaking. And so what happens with the party in the 1990s is that it becomes basically increasingly organized around big money and right-wing outrage stokers, particularly talk radio. Rush Limbaugh, becomes of age in the 1990s, and people forget this, but after Republicans took Congress in 1994, they invited Rush Limbaugh to their ceremony, saying that he was the reason for their new majority. They also celebrated the National Rifle Association, which Bill Clinton himself said was the number one reason he lost Congress in 1994. So that it was outrage and money that came together in this new Republican machine.
Yeah, and one element of the book that is clearly pretty important to this story is outside groups, which you focus on a lot. And in addition to, say, the NRA, you also mention evangelical Christians. And, in your discussion of that, I couldn't help thinking about a much earlier book from the early 2000s. Thomas Frank wrote a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, in which he basically argued that, conservatives are essentially working against the economic interests of some of their core voters, a big part of their core voters. But then at the time, I remember thinking, and I was still sort of transitioning from a conservative to center left, I guess you could say. I remember thinking, economics isn't everything. And religion and these social matters, they mean a lot to people. And maybe people on the left are underestimating the actual value of non-economic things like religion and, tradition as well. And I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, maybe we could break this into two pieces. There's a lot there, and
sure.
and well worth diving into. But maybe I could begin by saying a little bit about the emergence of what we call these surrogates and their relationship to the party, and we could talk a little bit about how we should think about whether people are actually pursuing their interests or not, because I think you're raising a really, really important point there.
Yeah.
But first, to just talk about the developing relationship between the party and these groups. So if the basic challenge with the emergence of this conservative dilemma with rising inequality is that the party has to figure out how they reconcile the interests of the economic elites that they're aligned with and who are increasingly popular or increasingly powerful, how they reconcile that with winning elections. The basic answer is that they reconcile it by getting voters to focus on other dimensions of politics. Frequently, these are going to be cultural divisions of one kind or another. But then the challenge is, how do you get the voters to do that? And the reality is that most parties, which are usually designed to be big tents, right? You got to be a pretty big tent to win elections in the U.S. They're not very good at stoking those kinds of intense feelings around these kinds of cultural issues. And so it becomes common, and we've shown in the book that this has happened in other countries in the past as well, sometimes with very dangerous effects. It becomes common to essentially develop relationships with groups that are focused on stoking outrage, that are deeply embedded in these communities and and are trusted and can communicate these kinds of messages effectively. And so for the modern American right, that is the main forms in which that takes are evangelical groups and other forms of Christian conservatism, the National Rifle Association, and more recently and somewhat distinctively, because of course it's not like a movement organization exactly. They're interested in making profits, but right-wing media, which we think is an extraordinarily important part of this overall machinery, this overall coalition, really excels at generating outrage. And all these forces become much more important in the Republican Party over the last 20 years, much more tightly aligned with the party. I'll just mention one other important aspect of this, which we think is really revealing, is that a nifty feature of the NRA and of evangelical organizations from the point of view of party leaders is that neither of those groups care very much about the economic agenda of the plutocrats, right? So as long as they feel like their policy interests, and maybe this leads nicely to your second question about whether we should see these voters as not defending their own interests or not, but a really elegant feature of this alliance from the point of view of party leaders who are trying to reconcile these things is that the things that the plutocrats care about, the NRA and evangelical leaders don't care very much about, and vice versa, right? Mm-hmm. So that provides a basis for a deal in which these outrage groups can mobilize popular support, much of it around a sense of fear or of threat, or of identity that is, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about this, identity that is often highly racial, at least implicitly, sometimes and increasingly explicitly racial. But in any event, it's a set of appeals that don't require the party to do much about the economics.
Right. So if I'm going to try to reformulate it a little bit. If I understand correctly, it's not so much that you're arguing that these non-economic things aren't important interests, tradition, religion, whatever, gun rights, whatever issues, but that groups are using fear and misinformation to essentially make people feel these things are more important or more imperiled, to basically keep their attention away from the economic interest, when if they hadn't been sort of manipulated or wild up in weighing those things, the economic interest would weigh more heavily. Is that a way to look at it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good summary of what we think these outrage stoking groups are doing, with the caveat that Paul already offered, that we think there is real policy content to many of these claims, and a lot of them center on the Supreme Court, which is a very convenient place for them to center, because, of course, the Supreme Court is a political institution that doesn't have to be responsive to majority public opinion, that can reflect the interest and demands of intense minority factions. So it just happens, and I think, we are a political system that has a very large role for the courts, and it's grown as Congress has grown more gridlock. But it also just happens that the kind of plutocratic populist agenda is one where you can put Supreme Court justices and lower court judges on the court who are both very conservative on social issues and very conservative with regard to business and economic issues. But let me get back to this question about voting against self-interest and the very lively book of Thomas Frank. Frank was writing, as you said, in the mid 2000s, and things have gotten a lot more intense since then. And I think it's a really elegant and well-written book. But if we're going to sort of summarize our differences with Frank, one point would be that we actually think there's a lot at stake in some of these cultural and social debates. They're not just symbolic politics, and the Supreme Court is a place where a lot of them play out. But another thing I think is that we think that the party has really constructed a kind of set of identities that allow them to suppress a lot of the kind of issue consideration that might cause people to, knowingly, if you will, vote against their self-interest. Instead, what's happening, I think, is, as you said, is that they're pressured to focus on other things, and also just to feel allegiance to the tribe, if you will, and that allows them. I mean, that leads to this crazy situation in which lots of Republican voters are screaming repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, but they're actually, when they start to think about and contemplate the loss of their own health coverage, they don't actually feel like that's a good thing for them, right? It's a kind of identity that that can lead to a kind of sloganeering and intense support for a party that is often pursuing policies that are unpopular and which are even recognized to be unpopular by their own voters. So, for example, in 2017, Republicans were trying, or 2018, after the 2017 tax cuts, Republicans were trying to run on the tax cuts, and they just kept finding, right, that even their own voters didn't like them. They didn't think a tax cut that involved $2 trillion in deficit spending, 80% of the permanent benefits of which went to the top 1%, was really a great policy. The last thing I would say, and this Paul was starting to talk about, is that Frank talks about this as kind of a culture war, but the racial element is just undeniable. Each of the groups we've talked about, the NRA, evangelical conservative Christianity, Christian right groups, and right-wing media, have proved were motivated by a racial backlash and have proved very able in using racial themes to pursue their outrage stoking. And so we could get back more into that, but I don't think you can understand how the Republican Party has built this odd bedfellows coalition without looking at the way in which the racial threat in particular has been central to its mobilizing effort.
Yeah, I did want to talk about that because it seems to me, number one, in having read your previous work, that isn't something that really came up in a big way in a lot of your previous analyses, which you mentioned in this book. But also, of course, we're at a moment now in the wake of the George Floyd killing, where this has become a front and center sort of issue, and maybe it puts Republicans in a more difficult position when some of these identities, when it gets tied into things that seem more and more to be indefensible or racially insensitive or so forth. And so I definitely was hoping you could kind of comment on that.
Well, we start the book with a mea culpa. I mean, I think that what's been going on in American politics in the last few years has been shocking to many observers, not just to us. I think many analysts, most analysts, would not have expected that a candidate who presented the way that Donald Trump did would be able to win a presidential election and maintain 90% approval within the Republican Party. And I think that was what got us started on this project, was recognizing that even though we'd been studying the Republican Party for almost 20 years, that we had really, really underestimated the role of racial divisions in the evolution of the Republican Party. And so this book, in many ways, is an attempt to wrestle with that, a failure to understand that, and to think about, but at the same time to argue that these racial issues have to be understood in combination with the dramatic increase in economic inequality and how that has shaped the incentives and coalitions within the Republican Party. So part of what we're trying to say in this here, I think it's hopefully a contribution both to the general public discourse around these issues, but also to political science. I think there are a lot of people who have framed the rise of Trump as being, the way that they put it is, well, is this about race, or is it about racial resentment, or is it about economic anxiety? It's one or the other. And I think increasingly when people frame it that way, they say, well, the evidence actually suggests, the public opinion evidence, for example, suggests that racial resentment is more important, that's the driving factor here. And I think our view would be that it's a mistake to put these two alternatives in some kind of intellectual cage match, right, in which only one can emerge as the winner, and that rather it's a matter of understanding. We think these matters are deeply intertwined, and that to try to understand why racial resentment resonates with a certain segment of the electorate, that one has to think about the profound economic changes which have both empowered this tiny sliver of the American population and given that sliver, that powerful sliver, and its allies strong incentives to activate the racial resentments that are there within the American populace. And Trump emerges as a figure who can do that.
Right. And, I don't think, I'll give you guys a bit of a pass on this because I don't think it's just you guys who missed this. I certainly missed it. And it seems to me that a lot of leading figures in the Republican Party itself missed this. I think back to the mid 2000s and what George W. Bush gets something like 44% of the Hispanic vote. And there are plenty of prominent Republicans talking about, Hispanics in particular being a natural GOP constituency and a move toward that and demographic change and all that. And all of a sudden, that just seems to be wiped away. And so I think this blindsided a lot of folks.
Definitely agree. And I think within the Republican Party, there are a couple off ramps, if you will, that Republicans might have taken from the path that they were set upon by Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. I think the first is actually around the time of George W. Bush, but ironically, it was W's opponent, John McCain, in the 2000 election, who set out a much more reform-minded vision that was more pluralistic, multiracial for the party than did W. Bush. And what happened next? I mean, McCain had a proposal. The big thing that George W. Bush was running on was tax cuts, particularly for the rich, and that's why the plutocrats within the party loved him.
Sure.
But McCain had a tax plan that was much more balanced. I think only 2% of its benefits would go to the top 1%, as compared with the 40% that ended up going to the top 1% under Bush's series of huge tax cuts. But he also wanted to do genuine political reform. And from Arizona, he had long been talking about immigration reform, which Bush, it should be said, was also generally supportive of. But what happened in the race was that in South Carolina, basically, Bush relied on surrogates in the evangelical conservative movement to smear McCain as a whole host of things that are not really worth going into. Right-wing media played an important role too. And it was really an illustration of how, when pushed to the wall, even more, ostensibly compassionate conservative candidates were willing to deploy some of this arsenal to gain power. What happened with Bush, I think, is quite useful for thinking about why the party moved in the direction of Trump. And the quote that I love to remind people of is when around 2013, when the autopsy report came out from the Republican National Committee, saying essentially that the party needed to broaden its base just a few years before Donald Trump doubled down on the white voting base. Well, around that time, Lindsey Graham said, "We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term." And so a lot of people now look back at George W. Bush wistfully. And what we say in the book, what we show in the book, is that the priority of putting the priority on these plutocratic aims just made it very hard for Bush to really help the party build a strong base within among Hispanic voters, because ultimately they cared about more than immigration reform. Of course, the other thing that they cared about economic policies that were broadly beneficial to the middle class, and those were not delivered. But I was going to say that of course it also is a case that these outrage stokers that the party had come to rely on were not the parties alone to control, and that they were increasingly allied with the more conservative right-wing elements of the party that were pushing for, against immigration reform and for more extreme kinds of cultural policies. And so, we don't want to suggest that the plutocrats are like, engineering this whole thing. As we say in the book, they're not like Bond villains in their hidden lair in the volcano. They wanted certain things, particularly they wanted big tax cuts. They like, deregulation of finance. They like a compliant administration, very pro-energy administration. But they needed votes. And to get those votes, they partnered with or encouraged partnership with groups that had their own agendas. And the result is that the party had a very hard time taking those off ramps and ended up in a place where Donald Trump was kind of the candidate that the Republican base could believe in.
Yeah. Well, even then, though, I mean, assuming Lindsey Graham of 2012 was right about that, it seems to me that part of the argument you're developing in the book is, well, this is what the modern Republican Party has done, but they're increasingly finding that it's not going to be necessarily enough or sustainable. And so then we see more of a move toward what you might call anti-democratic policies, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most alarming aspects of this. Maybe, well, I was going to say maybe the most alarming, though I think I should say that it's already very alarming in our view when a popularly elected government bestows its policies in a way that really benefits only the interests of a tiny fraction of the population. And I think we're experiencing now, this interview is taking place against the backdrop of a pandemic in which that the vital institution that we need to respond to it, the federal government, is completely incapable of doing so because so much of the apparatus has been, for public infrastructure has been gutted, and because the administration is filled with people who actually don't have the skills, the competence to engineer an appropriate response. And the priorities, both within the Republican Party in Congress and within the administration, are on protecting the economically privileged rather than responding to the crisis that we're facing. So just the effects of plutocrat-led government, I think, are already astonishingly damaging. But there is this developing dynamic as well, which is, as the demographics shift against the Republican Party, every year it gets a little bit harder just to win elections with the demographic coalition that the Republican Party is reliant upon now. The temptation, if you're not willing to adjust your policies in response to that, if you're not willing to reach out to these other voters, or if your base won't allow you to reach out to these other voters, then the temptation is to figure out some way that you can win elections anyway. And that's why, political scientists in the last few years have found themselves trying to understand research on other countries that we used to think was not relevant to the United States under the general label of democratic backsliding. And of course, the book by Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, two Harvard scholars, I think has played a critical role in introducing these ideas to an American audience, that democracy can slip away step by step. And that has clearly been happening, or at least elements of it have been happening in the United States in the last few years. Gerrymandering is one example of it. Voter suppression is another. Stacking the courts with people who will protect your ability to gerrymander and suppress voting is another element of this as well. But there are further steps that we can see some signs of. We're recording this interview on a day in which the president tweeted that maybe it was time to think about delaying the presidential election. Some people will say that wasn't serious. Some people will say it's attempt to distract from the horrible GDP growth numbers that came out this morning as well. But it's an astonishing thing to have an American president, publicly expressing that kind of idea.
And I mean, I've been on record, and I'll just repeat it again, that I'm deeply concerned about that. And it seems to me that when you have somebody who, at the head of the party, who I do not think, no matter what happens on November 3rd, will be willing to concede in any meaningful way, that's deeply troubling, given the president's following. But even more of an impediment, one might say, is the issue of institutional design that at least currently favors Republicans, right? Especially in the Electoral College in the Senate. And so there's this idea that even if raw numbers are on the side of the Democrats, perhaps, that's kind of a sort of a firewall, right?
Certainly that's been the feeling up until maybe 2018, when the firewall was high enough to keep Republicans from losing the Senate. In fact, they lost huge ground in the House, but didn't in the Senate. But I think people understand that, if there's a big enough wave, it can get over it can get over the flood walls that have been built. But I think you're right to emphasize something which is very important, is that the Republican Party has benefited more and more from the degree to which our political system itself advantages more rural areas. I mean, one way to think about this is that we have a political system that rewards parties for holding territory as well as for winning votes, and the Republicans hold a lot of territory. So the Senate is an obvious site for that
Sure.
For that advantage to play out. It used to be that there wasn't a huge correlation between rurality and vote for Republicans. Now there is, and as a result, the Senate is more and more going to the Republicans, despite the fact that across the country they're winning a minority of the popular vote. Or another way to put it is that the Senate is essentially massively overweighting Republican-leaning states. And that carries over to the Electoral College because of the way it's constructed. After all, the Republicans lost the popular vote. Trump lost the popular vote and won the presidency, but that's not an anomaly. In the last president to win, the last Republican to win a popular vote majority was George W. Bush in 2004. And in fact, Republicans have essentially lost the popular vote in every presidential election since 1988. But of course, they've captured the presidency in 3 of those elections. So that's another big advantage. In the House, as Paul said, it comes mostly from extreme partisan gerrymandering, but we should note that extreme partisan gerrymandering is a lot easier when A, you control a lot of states, and B, when your voters are spread out, while your opponent's voters are all concentrated in urban areas where you can pack them into a few districts, leading to a very large number of wasted Democratic votes in areas. So I won't go on, except for to say that I think that the story we tell is of a party that's in a race against demographic time. And they're really on the wrong side of the 2 great trends of our era, that is rising diversity and rising inequality. Their policy stances with regard to inequality are unpopular, and their voter base is white voting base is increasingly losing ground to a more diverse electorate that we see around us. But I think it's very important to understand that there are these very powerful advantages that allow them to hold on to power, and perhaps more worrisome, certainly more worrisome and perhaps more important, Republicans have figured out a lot of ways to control policymaking and stay in power despite not winning popular. So that's the big fear, right? This race against time could end with Republicans facing electoral defeat that leads them to more moderate positions and toward a truly multiracial party, or it could lead to them seeking further undermine our democracy and thereby threatening the vitality of the world's oldest constitutional democracy.
Now, of course, the Republican Party, when Donald Trump was elected, they had unified control of government for 2 years. And so one might say, well, if economic elites are in the driver's seat to the extent that some on the left argue they are, why didn't they put pressure on Senate Republicans to abolish the filibuster? They could have gotten rid of Obamacare. They could have done a bigger tax cut. They could have advanced so much more of their agenda, and yet that didn't happen. And isn't that a sign maybe that economic elites aren't as powerful in the GOP as some may think they are?
Well, it's a great question, and just to be clear, we're not arguing that they're all powerful.
Right.
That nobody ever gets everything that they want in politics. Certainly not in our separation of powers system. But we've been studying this alliance between Republicans and economic elites for 20 years now, and they have never had as much policy success as they had in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. Mitch McConnell described 2017 as the best year for conservatives across the board in the 30 years that he'd been in Washington. And Charles Koch, the leader of the very powerful Koch brothers network that has played such an important role in pushing reactionary economic policies, also said that he'd accomplished more in the last 5 years, basically since the rise of the Tea Party, moving on into the first year of the Trump administration, more in the last 5 years than in the previous 50 years that he'd been trying to influence politics. And they had very good reason to be so happy. They did get huge tax cuts. They got 2 Supreme Court justices who, people always talk about the position of these Supreme Court justices on the social issues, on religion or on guns or on abortion. But much more low profile, but extraordinarily important, has been the shift to the right on economic issues of the Supreme Court. This is an extremely corporate friendly Supreme Court. We could run through some of the decisions, but that's been a huge priority for the Chamber of Commerce and the Koch network and Mitch McConnell and so on. Mitch McConnell doesn't pursue that agenda because he cares about the social issues. He cares about the economic issues first and foremost. And they also have played an incredibly prominent role, these forces within the Trump administration. You look at an agency like the EPA, which we chronicle in the book, but it's just illustrative. The same thing has happened across the federal bureaucracy, where lobbyists, figures from the Koch brothers network itself, have been placed in top positions in these agencies to pursue the kinds of policies within this powerful bureaucracy that they favor. So it's true that these groups didn't get all that they wanted, and there are some issues where, like trade, for example, where they probably had to hold their noses. But they've achieved staggering policy victories, far greater than the ones that they achieved under the previous high water mark for these plutocratic interests with George W. President.
You mentioned the Trump administration, and I want to make an argument that, well, maybe if a Republican as a liberal speaking, this is, and again, not considering the pandemic, so that's a whole different story, but the incompetence of the response, but putting that aside, which I understand is impossible to do, but I would argue that you can make a case that if any Republican were to be elected out of the group that was running, it would maybe have been best to have Donald Trump elected because of the administration's, I'll charitably call it, lack of experience, his combative nature, his positions on immigration and trade that definitely don't really favor the economic elite, that at least a Donald Trump administration on those economic issues has been a bit of a speed bump where, like I say, a Marco Rubio administration surely would have been more experienced and would be able to finesse some of these things through, and it would have actually advanced that agenda more. So in a weird way, Donald Trump has maybe been a bit of a disappointment compared to a lot of other Republicans who could have been elected. And I wonder what you thought about that.
I have to say, Mike, I see one element of that argument, and I'll come back to it, but mostly I disagree. And I disagree. For one thing, it's just impossible to put aside the 150,000 plus Americans who died in this crisis, far, far more than would have absent Donald Trump being in the White House. But I also think, let's just put aside the policy for a moment. I think Donald Trump has really undermined American democracy. In doing so, he has continued trends within the Republican Party but he's massively intensified them. There's that scene in Spinal Tap where the guitarist is explaining how great it is that his amp can go all the way to 11, right?
Yeah.
And so Donald Trump turned the dial to 11. And when you turn the dial to 11 on, say, vote rigging or norm breaking or destroying the guardrails or demanding loyalty in a separation of powers system where the only protection against presidential aggrandizement is that that Congress asserts its own institutional independence. When you do that, you really undermine democracy. And I think that's just a huge cost. There are two ways in which there's two ways in which I agree, and I'll briefly summarize them. One is, it's very scary that an incompetent authoritarian-minded president is able to get as far as Donald Trump is, right?
Sure.
It suggests that a more skillful practitioner of his politics might well have done better. And the second way I agree is that this is an open debate, but the big defeat in the first 2 years for the Republicans was their failure to move forward on a healthcare bill. And the goal in their healthcare bills had always been consistently, right, not just to diss the Obama efforts, right, but to roll back those valued health protections so they could provide tax cuts to rich people. They still ended up providing tax cuts to rich people and corporations, but they could have been a lot bigger, maybe better from some people's standpoint, if they had gotten the healthcare bill through, and they didn't. And, given how close it was, people forget, right? This was a nice edge proposition. Given how close it was, perhaps a more skillful president could have managed to usher it through. And that would have been actually a bigger victory for the plutocrats. But I think all things considered, the Trump presidency has showcased both the dark side of both the right-wing populist and anti-democratic elements of the party and the plutocratic elements of the party. And indeed, I think it was because the plutocrats were so pleased with so much of what they've got that they were willing to tolerate developments within the party that may now be threatening the future of those gains, but also threatening our democracy.
Yeah. As we kind of wind up, we focused almost entirely on Republicans, and certainly rightly so. That's what your book is about. I hate those interviewers who ask people questions about what they didn't write about, but I'm going to do that anyway, just briefly. So I hope you'll bear with me. I kept this to the end for that reason. But I wonder about the Democrats. I mean, I'm a Democrat, and sometimes I feel the arguments that people make about the party having missed an opportunity, and, maybe radicalizing themselves and missing the chance to embrace kind of a people's populism as opposed to a plutocratic populism, that there's a missed opportunity on the left as well here. And if they hadn't turned off a certain number of voters, I mean, it wouldn't have taken many, right, in 2016, and we'd be looking at a very, very different situation. And so, again, knowing that that's not your focus, I'd still like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, yes, it's a completely fair question, Mike. And, we made a conscious choice in this book. We wanted to keep it focused and concise as we as academics could manage. And so there are a lot of things that are very worthy of discussion that we didn't go into in any kind of depth. And certainly we made a conscious decision not to spend too much time talking about the Democrats. But I think the point that you've raised is completely fair. And the way that we put it in Winner Take All Politics, going back 3 books now, before, the way we put it in Winner Take All Politics was that rising inequality has had profound effects on both political parties, but different effects on the two political parties. For Republicans, it's pushed them way to the right, and comfortably so. They've simply embraced it. They've embraced the winners in the winner-take-all economy. For Democrats, because they were positioned differently to begin with, they traditionally have been the working-class party, the party that's more open to redistribution. They've been cross-pressured. They are conflicted as they deal with the realities that economic and political power is much more concentrated in the hands of the wealthy and corporations than it was 30 or 40 years ago. The unions, for example, which still remain a force in the Democratic Party, but they're far, far weaker in American society than they were a generation or two ago. So Democrats have been conflicted, and there's no question that has made it more difficult for them to respond effectively to the kinds of economic strains that ordinary Americans face, and that's limited their political response, and it is sometimes, as I think it did in 2016, put them in a position where they're backing a candidate who, for a variety of reasons, does not do an effective job of articulating the economic case for the Democratic Party.
Right. And while I would love to, I'm sure the three of us could go on for another hour on that and other topics. I know we're pretty much up against our hard limit, but I do have one final question for you. It's a question I hope I get a certain answer to, but how optimistic are you that our institutions will kind of respond in the way we hope they will, and that we won't have a system that at least long term is captured so much by plutocratic interests?
Well, first, Mike, thank you so much for this really stimulating conversation, and for many before this between us. And this may be one area where Paul and I actually disagree, because I tend to be somewhat more optimistic than him. It's all relative. Paul and I seem to be on a mission to turn political science into the true dismal science. but I'm, relatively speaking, the more optimistic of the two. And part of the reason I am is that I actually think what we're seeing. So there are two reasons. One is the one that we've talked about. The demographic shifts are powerful, and they're adverse. And Donald Trump, with his catastrophic mishandling of this crisis and his doubling down on a set of really narrow and extreme and racist appeals, has really magnified the chance that there's going to be a massive electoral reversal. Now, I think we've already expressed a lot of worry about what's going to happen in November. Republican senators push back against Trump's assertion that we should move the election. Yeah. So there are some limits, but still, we cannot be confident that, especially if the election is close. Actually, if we can be confident that if the election is close, it's going to be highly contested and really ugly. But my optimism also stems from, so putting aside that fear, my optimism also stems from the sense that the party is working through a set of really difficult, Democratic Party is working through a set of really difficult issues that are going to put it in a better place to appeal to ordinary voters on economic grounds. And I won't elaborate on that, but one thing that Paul and I have been thinking a lot about is that set of appeals really has to figure out how to bridge the urban, non-urban divide that has been so central to our politics. And because Democrats essentially have to start on the 30-yard line because of the rural bias of our institutions, they're the party that's going to have to figure this out if they want to win and hold power for the long term. Yeah. And I'm a little more encouraged than I have been in the past that they may well be able to.
Well, that's good. Paul, do you want to end things on a more pessimistic note?
No. I think it's good to end on this note. So it's good that you directed this question to Jacob, though he always, listening to him always makes me more optimistic. So I'll just echo his thanks for a really, really stimulating set of questions.
Right. Well, it was great to talk to both of you this time, and I look forward to talking with you when your next book comes out. I'm sure it will be soon because you put them out at an impressive rate, and they're all great to read. I've enjoyed them all, assigned many in my classes, and I really appreciate both of you taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
So, Jay, what did you take away? What any kind of initial thoughts about what Jacob Hacker and Paul Patterson had to say, or what I maybe had to say back to them? What occurred to you after hearing that interview?
Well, first, I would say there's a lot to cover there.
Yeah.
And you and I both we talked before this. Initially, a lot of times when we do these interview reactions, it's just sort of I listen to it, do kind of a hot take, and we kick around what we think. But there is a whole lot of stuff to cover here, and a lot of it I think is stuff that's kind of sensitive. And to the extent I respond to it, particularly the comments about race and the Republican Party, I want to put that together a little more fully. So you and I said we're going to have a bigger show talking about those aspects of it specifically. I guess, stepping back, the 30,000 foot view is I think what they misunderstand, and again, this is me telling to Ivy League professors what they misunderstand, but having worked with the Republican Party and in the Republican Party in various aspects, the idea that there is some kind of plan like this, it sort of boggles the imagination. And I'd like, gosh, if I could take these guys to the party headquarters for a day or so, and we could just spend a day walking around, seeing what everybody does, and talking things up, I think they might radically change their view. I mean, so much of what, at least in my view, that has happened in the Republican Party, there's not this grand strategic thinking of we'll build this unholy alliance between corporate plutocrats and the great unwashed populists. It's more like, geez, can we find a candidate to run in this seat? Geez, can we find some money to raise to support this person? Hey, what sells in this candidate's district versus what sells in that candidate's district? So I mean, I guess there's sort of a fundamental disagreement I have with their premise that this is how stuff works. I think it's actually sort of the other way around, that it's more a grassroots bottom up type thing of the party responds to what it hears from its members, its voters, in terms of what issues are important. For example, one of the things you talked about was, there's this focus on one aspect on social issues on the Supreme Court and these sort of things. And their implication, at least as I understood it, was, well, that's because there's sort of this messaging that's put out that these things are outrageous, and therefore this is what ought to get voters wound up, and it's sort of this fake outrage. I dispute that and say, no, I think a lot of cases it's real outrage, and there are certainly people and organizations out there that stoke this, but they're typically not part of the party apparatus. In fact, often they're sort of well outside the party apparatus, and the party would often rather they weren't there. But I think there's this idea that this is some sort of top-down brainwashing kind of thing. Isn't the case. And look, the biggest example of a lot of this is Donald Trump. In that no party elite folks saw him or wanted him. This was a populist movement, and sort of to the best efforts of,
That's one of the things I asked him about.
Yeah. I just don't see that as being reflective of that there's some sort of Faustian bargain here.
Well, I certainly, and that's a point where I disagree with them. I certainly think that from as a liberal, I'm, in some weird ways. I mean, again, I talked about coronavirus aside. That's, I think they pointed out it's impossible to put that aside, but that Donald Trump has certainly has policies that aren't aligned with kind of the larger picture there, because he's just kind of a wild card. But to your other point, and maybe I don't recall if I talked to them about this beforehand or if it made its way in, but one of the things that Paula Jacobs said to me at some point was, it's not like we're saying that there are these guys twisting their mustaches and cackling or anything like that. They're not saying that it's a plot so much, and maybe that didn't come through in the interview, just that you kind of go where the money is and you go where the influence is. And the Republican Party reached out to those interests because there was more of a natural alignment at first. And what it's doing is systematically distorting everything. And I agree with you that it's very hard for me to believe that there are these dastardly people in their, in their Bond headquarters kind of deciding how they're going to crush the little guy. But I don't think it's nearly as unbelievable that the Republican Party in general is being distorted by the influence of these very powerful, economically and politically powerful actors. any more than you would probably disagree that the Democratic Party is, to a certain extent, distorted by the influence of, say, teachers' unions and trial lawyers.
Yeah. No, and I think to that, I think it's right, but that's sort of an unremarkable conclusion to come to, right? That money plays a big part in politics. And I guess the other thing that struck me that, you know, when we talk about inequality, which was one of their big themes, was there's somehow this idea that it's a plot of the right or a goal of the right to have this inequality. If you look at where this inequality exists, you know, these big massive shifts in you know, dramatic differences in income, they're not in Kansas. You know, they're not in Alabama. They are on the coasts. They are, and these big money corporate folks have become, at least to the public, very much woke on social issues, particularly as of late. And I disagree with that's why I said I want to almost take more time to unpack a lot of this. But I don't think you can say that, you know, look, the inequality in terms of what people have and then political spending, also that doesn't seem to make sense, because look, the Clinton campaign spent a lot more money than the Trump campaign. So, you know, look, is there this, is the financial inequality that they're complaining about, is that really being translated into political inequality? And as the subtitle says, how the right controls, or the right rules, I forget the word. But I mean, my response is, my gosh, the rights, you know, we're not in control of nothing.
Well, I would say if you take a look at lobbying spending and campaign spending as a whole, as opposed to just singling out one particular very unusual campaign, because of Donald Trump certainly, and to a lesser extent Hillary Clinton, you would see that organizations that one would typically call conservative far outspend organizations that one might call conservative, or liberal or worker oriented, and that it's not even close, basically.
Well, but let's I mean, again, we got to go to the real numbers there in terms of what we're talking about. Are we talking about campaign contributions?
Everything.
Are we talking about lobbying spending?
Yeah, that too.
Or things also that are, for example, you know, a lot of union activities which are not political in the sense that their contributions, they're still sort of party building, you know.
No matter how you look at the numbers, I mean, I don't think there's any possible way to massage the data to not find that, organizations that one would typically call conservative far outspend organizations one would typically call liberal. And certainly there would have been a little more of an equality back when unions were any kind of a significant factor in American life. But really, since the 1980s or so, unions have been in a steep decline in the United States.
Okay, so for the sake of argument, let's I'll accept that premise.
Sure.
Okay, let's say conservative right-wing groups spend a whole lot more. How is that translated?
Great question.
Into any victory? Because look, if you look at all of our major cities and major counties in which those cities are located are controlled by Democrats almost exclusively, and have been in many cases for decades, in many cases for centuries. You know, I think the balance in the Senate is 50-50. Or I'm not 50-50, but it's exceedingly close, and there's you know, widespread belief that the Democrats will take the Senate. The Democrats control the House by a fairly wide margin. You know, if you look at state legislatures, Republicans typically fare better there, and in governor's offices fare better there. But still, it's hard to say. I mean, if the premise of this is the right has all this money and it's spending all this money and it's controlling the world, you know,
it's an important point.
Also the you know, Trump election, which maybe you can put an asterisk and say, well, look, this was just weird. But Barack Obama was elected to 2 terms, and during 1 term had control of the Senate, control of the House. I guess I'm not seeing where's the right-wing control of stuff.
It's a great point. And political scientists and policy analysts have looked at that in a fairly systematic way. And what they tend to define is that when there is disagreement between what you might call economic elites and regular people, economic elites get their policy preferences the vast majority of the time. And so the argument from the policy analyst perspective would be that when you look at actual policy outcomes, when there is a dispute between quote unquote, the people and the elites win far more often than one would expect. And the argument is that because they have much more political economic power that translates into political power. And so there've been some very comprehensive studies of that done about both federal and state policy. And I find them to be very convincing.
Right. But that's kind of to my point is, again, Barack Obama was very much the candidate of the economic elites, but he certainly wasn't, a candidate of the right. Donald Trump, who went astray from most of typical conservative ideology, was certainly not a candidate of the elite, and he won. So again, I'm not seeing the. I guess there's sort of this idea that economic policy and economic elites necessarily is a right wing thing, and I think it's quite the opposite. And if you're the other piece of that so much of the inequality that we talk about occurred during the Obama administration, when what was going on was you had a slower economic recovery for the guy on the street, right? But because of actions mainly through the Fed, the stock market was still flying high. So if you had money in equities and if you had money to spend, money to invest, by the end of those 8 years, or let's say end of 2008 to 2016, 2017, you did really well for yourself. It wasn't necessarily a matter of even any legislative policy. It was more monetary policy, I think. Other than you want to say maybe the legislative policy kept the little guy down a little bit more. But I guess that's sort of, I guess where I'm disputing their premise.
Right. I guess my response to that would be is that most people the people who are the least well off are the people who have the least stake in sort of the stock market and that sort of thing, and so they that exacerbates these inequalities, and that
and to me those are Trump voters.
Okay, and so in terms of the Trump issue, I think you and I actually significantly agree. I think that they're wrong. I mean, my sense of things is that Donald Trump was at least a speed bump in the way of what they're arguing is this larger project. You and I disagree about whether there is this sort of larger project, whether it's intentional or not. But I think where we agree and where we disagree with Hacker and Pearson is that Donald Trump represents something that the elites wouldn't have wanted, and suggests that at least under certain circumstances, things can happen, big things can happen in national politics that at least temporarily disrupt elite dominance of the system. Yeah. Yeah.
I see, to me, I guess there's this, the question is, okay, is Donald Trump just a speed bump, a weird asterisk, something, was just a weird thing that year because of Hillary Clinton, the FBI, sure, all the other stuff going on, or was it a fundamental party realignment?
Yeah, I think it's the former. I think it's just that things will go back to business as usual. I think whether or not down in either in 2021 or in 2025, I think things will just go back to essentially what they were, and the Republican Party will continue to champion sort of trade policies and immigration policies that make sense for their biggest donors, and those aren't things that Donald Trump champions. And I think he's been a disruptive force in a lot of ways because he's Captain Chaos. And as you pointed out many times, one thing that economic elites don't like is a chaotic, unpredictable environment. So,
I guess let's go back then to another sort of weird thing, because so often there is sort of, I think in the economic world, or not economic, academic world, obviously Trump bad, Orange Man bad. But look, if the economic elites had their way, we would have much fewer restrictions on immigration, which I'd be okay with.
Me too.
Because look, business needs labor. We had, at least again, as of pre-pandemic, there were a whole lot of jobs. There were more people. There were more jobs than there were people looking for jobs. That's changed, and hopefully that changes back again. But I guess the other thing is, well, is that bad, and is it again a right-wing sort of issue? That's where I take issue that it's sort of this is how the right controls the masses, and yet serves its economic masters, because I just don't think it's doing that. I don't think it's doing both. If you ask any I think typical conservative, how do you, and what I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. I guess the other piece, when they talked about sort of Supreme Court appointments, and well, this is how that plays into politics. Again, my counter would be, well, what about John Roberts? What about Neil Gorsuch? I mean, they've certainly issued opinions of late that depart from what the populist impulse would be. So again, are we really seeing this control? I don't see it.
Yeah, and I would argue that they're largely right, though they are incorrect in the perhaps almost total extent and so forth. So I would argue I differ with them in terms of level of control. In fact, I would go further, and I think they'd agree with me, that plenty on the kind of moderate left are also, the whole field has basically shifted to the right. But that's a bigger argument for another day. But and also,
again, how can you say the whole field shifted to the right than when we just talked last week about the Cori Bush election? And they're getting more and more.
Yeah, I'm not talking about specific elections. I'm talking about like larger policy, larger outcomes in terms of things like we see with taxation, with worker protections, with stuff like that. Things that I think really matter to regular people, that I see union membership, things that I see going away and becoming less of a factor over the last 20, 30 years. And I think that largely economic interests have co-opted not only the entirety of the right with what I think are bad arguments, but also, certain segments of the left.
All right. Well, okay. And again, I'm just thinking back to, if you're talking about, worker protections, you just had a Trump appointed justice write an opinion on, essentially writing transgender rights into the
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I agree with you. I think
the idea that the right wing is winning on worker protection issues because of Supreme Court. I just don't see it.
And I agree with you that you can definitely point out instances where that's not the case. But I think the overall trend is very, very clear in a lot of areas, and it's kind of against. It's against, I would say, regular sort of lower to lower middle class Americans, and much more in favor of upper middle, upper class Americans.
So, and this is something I don't think you really talked about. Well, maybe we'll hit this on when we talk about this again. But you and I think one of our catchphrases, not our catchphrase really, but maxims is sort of that politics is downstream from culture.
Sure. Yeah.
And a lot of things, we're looking at the big corporate elite plutocrats. Increasingly, they're wading into and responding to the culture and creating sort of and look, in fairness, they wrote this book before the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter explosion that we saw in the last couple of months. But it was still out there that you have, in many cases, corporate America, plutocrat America, that is pushing a lot of these social pieces of the left. So again, I think that just doesn't square with their hypothesis, or they didn't really take a look at that because I don't know. I mean,
I see what you're saying, and I agree that on certain social issues that don't necessarily have a huge effect on the bottom line, that there are these pushes. But when it comes to like the nitty gritty of what's going to affect, what's going to benefit the shareholders and the people in the executive suite, that we see a very strong non-progressive agenda.
Well, let's hope so.
Let's hope not. Actually,
no. And actually, there was a good Wall Street Journal piece on that sort of made that point that it looks like in a lot of cases these corporations are giving very much lip service to their wokeness.
Yeah, I agree with
but
that.
It hasn't translated into any changes. Now that said, I'm not sure exactly what changes it would translate into, other than, again, I get emails from Chipotle telling me about racial equality and black, and I was like, I just want a burrito, and I get this from every sort of place that I do business with, right? I get these crazy emails telling me all about.
And I'm saying it's essentially it's very low cost for Chipotle to do that, but doing something like providing their employees with good health insurance or higher wages, well, that's where they draw the line, because it's easy to just say, oh yes, we love everyone, please be our customers, don't boycott us. But it's another thing to say, well, we're gonna pay our employees a living wage and that sort of thing. That's a lot harder to do.
But none of this should be taken as a shot at Chipotle. Just happen
not at all,
because I'm a big fan of their products. If anything, it's just a matter of again, my 50-year-old conservative mind can't get around just the idea of why so many corporate interests are wading into these sort of things and making statements, and sort of then we'll make a contribution to this organization or that organization. But again, it goes back to the point of, look, still, if you're saying that this is somehow the plutocrats running the country, corporate interest, moneyed interest running the country, they are still out there sort of driving and supporting a lot of this, a lot of these social issues.
Yeah,
so,
and I agree with you that I think that there is something to be said about that distinction between pocketbook issues and social issues. And I raised that question, and I feel like while they admitted that, yeah, it was a thing, I think a lot of people on the left perhaps don't appreciate the value of these kind of non-economic things to a lot of people. And it does weigh in a little more than I think many people on the left give it credit for. So on that, I think you and I
there was sort of the sense that I got there making the argument that well, I mean, they were making there that sort of all these populist voters have been sort of this false consciousness sort of thing,
sure.
That they're voting against their interests because, gosh, they're too dumb to know what their interests are, and they've been misled by these folks telling them that all these other social issues matter. But I think that's just fundamentally wrong. And it, again, I don't want to accuse them of being in bubbles, but look, I think if they got out and talked to a whole lot of people, there are people who sense it's not even economic concern, although economic concern is part of it. There is this sort of, the center cannot hold kind of thing, widening gyre, all that bit, that everything that they knew, believed is now being and not even disagreed with or changed, but
the privilege is being challenged.
The social whipsaw that so many folks are going through. I think there's something to that, and it's not easy to quantify.
Sure,
but it's not nothing.
Well, and at the same time, when you're more economically insecure and then socially there's a lot of changes, that's tough to deal with all of that at once. And so,
I agree, and I'd say the economic piece is part of it.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, like you said, there's a lot there, and we will, we for a long time, I think, well, not for a long time, but certainly in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and everything that kind of came from that, we felt the need to maybe take a little more time and talk more fully about race and politics. We haven't done that yet, but as Jay said before we started recording today, we agreed that that's something we really wanted to devote, certainly a longer segment, maybe an entire episode to, and that is something you can expect to see in the not too distant future. And I'm looking forward to having that conversation.
And look, I will put the caveat out there right now. This is, two white guys,
Absolutely.
two white, middle-aged,
reasonably comfortable. Yeah.
highly educated,
White
guys talking about this. And to the extent we can get other voices, I think we're going to look to do that.
Sure.
But again, to me, the bigger thing that troubled me from the interview was there was this implication that there is an underlying sort of racial agenda in this, and that's what I really wanted to push back on in our next time we talk about this.
And we'll do that. Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone for listening. And again, we appreciate your support. If you are not a supporter, because this is our kind of in place of our regular Saturday show, it would be great if you could become one going to patreon.com/politicsguys, or if you can't afford to become a supporter, but you want to keep on getting all of our content, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up with access to everything we put out. And if you could, please subscribe to the show, leave ratings and reviews, and especially share your favorite episodes on social media or email. Getting the word out is just super important to keeping us going. And if you just want to generally mail us about something, it's mail@politicsguys.com. Check out our Bipartisan Politics subreddit, our Facebook group, and finally, a special thank you to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Nathan Sosnowski. Today's show is produced by me, Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new episode next week. We hope you join us.